good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode 147, where we are looking at the subject of prisons and prisoners. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, in Portree, in Fort William and in Wick. Every time I say welcome to Learn with Lorna, I always feel like it's a strange thing for me to say to adults, but you must remember that we started the series looking at home educating children, so it did make more sense when we were that kind of instructional title. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work and enable us to keep doing all sorts of different things that we do, then we're very grateful for that. There's a link to be able to donate both in the Facebook page where you're watching live, and also in the YouTube channel if you're watching subsequently. So this week we are looking at a subject carrying on our theme of changes. A subject that has seen, or an area that has seen a huge amount of change over the centuries, and that is prisons. And I've mentioned several times over the course of the years that I've done these talks how much I enjoy working with Inverness Prison and the Fife College education team there. It is one of the most satisfying parts of my job, and I always come away from it having learned more than I went in with, and hopefully that they feel the same way. And it's something I'll be doing again next week. I'm going into the prison to work with the guys in there next week. So in between working in the prison in and out in the 2020s and working with records about prisons from the 1700s, say, you really, having that comparison really gives you a chance to see how much has changed over the years. And we hold references in our collections to various types of prison, from makeshift prisons in times of crisis. So for instance, during the Jacobite risings, churches might have been used as prisons, to purpose-built prisons in the boroughs and prisoner of war camps, both in the Highlands and overseas. So we have a lot of references to prisons in our collections. I'm going to start with what springs to mind probably when you say the word prison, a typical prison where people are held as punishment for a specific wrongdoing for a specific amount of time. And I wanted to start with a little bit of background around who ran prisons in the past, where were they usually situated, who was in charge of them, who oversaw the life and work in the prison. So this is an extract from the National Records of Scotland website, and I've talked several times about the NRS guides. If you're interested in a particular subject, whether that's courts or legal records or immigration, schools, whatever it might be, the National Records of Scotland has a really useful set of research guides which very quickly summarises an overview of that subject. And this is their extract around prisons and Scottish prisons and the legislation relating to them. Before the Jail Act 1823, the condition of Scotland's prisons was variable, but most were poor. Their management fell to borough councils who were underfunded and lacked both the means and the willingness to improve facilities and accommodation for prisoners. This Jail Act, instigated by Robert Peel as Home Secretary, so he is, as you'll know if you're from Britain or from Scotland, you'll know Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, he was responsible for first police force, which is why we call them peelers or bobbies. This Jail Act marked the start of government efforts to improve standards in prisons across the United Kingdom. It saw the removal of the use of manacles and irons from prisoners, payments of salaries for prison staff, regular visits by religious leaders, and permitted supervision of female prisoners by female wardens. Further improvement measures were put into place with the introduction of the Prisons Act 1835. This saw the appointment of 5 salaried prison inspectors who enforced the rebuilding of many prison buildings to implement a new and separate system of imprisonment. The principles of the separate system outlined in an Act to Improve Prisons and Prison Discipline of 1839 proposed a general prison for Scotland to facilitate complete separation of prisoners serving a sentence longer than 9 months. Perth Depot, a former military fort, was selected to be Scotland's first general prison, as outlined under the 1839 Act, which vested general superintendence of all Scottish prisons in the General Board of Directors of Prisons in Scotland. County boards were set up, which took over the management of all local prisons, except the General Prison in Perth, which was administered directly by the General Board and was regarded as a government institution for the detention of criminals undergoing long sentences. The Prisons Scotland Act 1860 saw many smaller prisons in Scotland close. And then in passing 1877, this act saw complete control of Scottish prisons pass to the Home Office in London. So, very generally, to kind of summarise that, we can see that for many years prisons were often run by borough councils and they were often poorly maintained and poorly equipped. Then, from the 1820s onwards, conditions started to improve, and then in the 1830s and 40s, we start to see constructions of new prisons and new cells, and the creation of county prison boards to oversee them. So, for hundreds of years, prior to these kind of changes in the mid-1800s, there were prisons or holding cells across the Highlands, in places as various as Inverness, Dornoch, Dingwall, Tain, Wick, Nairn, all over, and all with their own story of how they had come about and how they had developed and been rebuilt and changed and so on. Now, I'm going to look predominantly at Inverness for records pre-1830s, because that's the bulk of the records that we have. But I would encourage you, if you're interested in the subject, to go and have a look at some of those other prisons. Historic Environment Scotland has some very useful information about them, so does British Listed Buildings website, and also the relevant local museums. So for instance, Tain Museum or Cromarty Courthouse or Nairn Museum will have specific information about their local prisons. Many of them in those early days prior to those big acts that brought change in the mid-1800s, many of them would have been housed in tollbooths or townhouses, so they're in part of a civic structure. They might have one or two cells which would be used to house those accused of a crime alongside civil prisoners. Often they would be sited, as I say, alongside a civic building or a court, as opposed to being in purpose-built prison buildings. So if we take Inverness as an example, for many years the main prison was the toll booth, and again, if you're familiar with Inverness, you will know that the toll booth building is opposite McDonald's on the corner of Church Street and Bridge Street. It's not entirely the same building, but bits and pieces of it are from that time when it was used as a prison. It housed prisoners for centuries, but it wasn't a very large building. It adjoined the courthouse, and apparently it had 2 small cells for criminals and 1 miserable room for civil debtors. And that was to serve not only Inverness Borough, but also Inverness County, which is substantial, and also some of the surrounding areas beyond the county boundaries as well. And so you can imagine those 2 rooms plus the 1 miserable room were not sufficient. In 1786, petitioning began for funding to build a new prison. And Inverness Town Council said then that it was so crowded with prisoners that their situation was deplorable, that generally about 30 people were held in the 2 rooms, which were all under 13 feet square. So you can imagine the image of that overcrowding. Now, one solution of this overcrowding was to put some of the prisoners in the vault. And the vault sounds completely and utterly terrifying. So I wanted to read to you an extract from Leonella Longmore's brilliant book Inverness in the 18th century. Leonella, an extraordinary writer, extraordinary researcher, and this book was written using, amongst other things, our collections. So this tells you a little bit about what happened if the toll booth was so crowded that the vault needed to be used. Miserable as this jail was, the toll booth, it must have been luxury compared with the pit that served as the extra lockup in the old stone bridge, swept away by the Great Flood of 1849. When it was built, the bridge, when it was built in 1685, a vault of about 6 feet high and 8 feet long was constructed between the second and third arches. In Recollections of Inverness by an Invernessian, Donald Munro describes this hellhole. It was entered from above, in the roadway of the bridge, by a trapdoor, which, when raised, disclosed a flight of stone steps leading to the interior. There was an iron-grated window to the south side of the arch, for the purpose of putting in provisions and giving light to such as had the misfortune to be confined therein. There were also 2 small stone benches on each side for resting upon, and a round hole in the floor where the prisoner could put down a flagon with a rope for water, and which would also answer the purpose of putting away any filth which might accumulate. It's really conjuring up quite a picture. It goes on to describe someone who was put in there who was believed to be insane. They go on to say, whether or not the prisoners like Alan were insane, incarceration in the dismal bridge dungeon would have been enough to send them out of their minds. No human contact for days, months, years on end, forever tormented with the constant sound of horses' hooves above and the rushing waters of the river below. In 1720, 2 servants of Simon Lord Lovat, accustomed to the freedom and the pure air of the Aird, could stand it no longer. The previous year their laird had quarrelled with Patrick Robertson, chamberlain to the Lady Dowager of Lovat, whereupon the chamberlain's barns and cornyard were destroyed by fire. There was little doubt that Lovat was behind it. However, his servants, William Fraser and Alexander Fraser, who had carried out his wish, had to take the blame. Since the Tolbooth was not considered secure enough for Lord Lovat's followers, the 2 men were lodged in the bridge vault. In their desperation, they sent a petition to the magistrates, begging to be removed to the Tolbooth. We are shut up close and exposed to all rains that fall down from the firmament without any kind of shelter. And oftentimes our prison is so full of rain that it almost covers half of our bodies, by which we were lately like to be drowned. And the prison was tight. The narrowness of it and the great many rats frequenting it are enough to render your petitioners most miserable and weary of our lives, which cannot subsist long if there's not latitude given to us, and we are removed from this intolerable to a more reasonable and easy prison. Luckily for them, they were allowed the desired luxury of the Tolbooth. All things are relative. Goes on to say that the dank pit still housed the wretched. An item from the borough accounts of 12th of November 1735 details the expenses incurred by the hangman for burying the man who died in the bridge vault. It goes on to say that the Tolbooth, although they call it the easy prison, they would rather be in the easy prison. It was better in that it was above ground, but it says the worst place in the Tolbooth appears to have been the vault of the steeple, where for over 3 years John Sinclair of Caithness was imprisoned for debt. In 1709 he too petitioned the magistrates and lamented his lot. He says, having not the use or the benefit of the least fire or little candle light allowed to me, not so much fire as to warm me, one drink or any other necessary sustentation, though ever so sick or unwell. When the wind blows more than ordinarily, it will blow out any candle, and would whirl the clothes of the bed where I lie. When there was rain more than ordinary, I would be necessitated to alter and change my bed twice or thrice in the night, in the dark, without light. And when there are dry snow with wind, it will cover white the floor, the bed, and the bedclothes. So really vivid descriptions in Leonella's book of both the vault and the Tolbooth and the black hole. And those were the sorts of conditions that were probably common across all the prisons in the Highlands. Prisons were cold, dark places of punishment. We have, as I've mentioned and as I've done on previous episodes around court stories and crimes, we have many hundreds of records that detail or give insights into why people found themselves in prison in the first place. For anything from theft and murder, so crimes that we would completely recognise, to other reasons such as insanity. So prisons would be used as places in a case where there was no other secure place to put someone, even if they hadn't committed a crime, but they needed to be secured or removed or contained. We can see in those extracts that I shared there from Leonella Longmore's book how awful the conditions could be. Stories of hypothermia, of hunger, of rats, and some of those continued past those key dates of the 1830s and 40s, and I'll come back to that. Most people in those early years would have seen their sentences out and left, hopefully not to return. Some were removed from prison in return for joining the forces. If there were extra soldiers or sailors needed for any particular conflict, then they could be taken from prison, sometimes to serve in the forces. But what about the people who tried to leave before their sentences were up? I was absolutely amazed when I started looking into this to see how many people had attempted escapes and how many people had succeeded with their escape attempts. And when you consider how harsh the sentences were, we're talking months and months, for 6 months for wearing a kilt, for example, such harsh sentencing, it makes you wonder why so many people were brave enough to try and escape these, mind you, the horrible conditions. So maybe that's why. We can see evidence of this for hundreds of years in the collection. So in 1678, Alexander Dunbar, who was the provost of Inverness at the time, protested that the toll booth needed to be more secure after a thief was able to ignore all locked doors and make his escape by digging a hole. Walls and padlocks and locks and all sorts of things really didn't seem to make much difference in stopping this happening. This is a fantastic document from 1750 from our court records that records what happened one night in August 1750. So it says that appeared David Vance, one of the borough officers of the said borough, who, being solemnly sworn and interrogated, deposed that he was the jailer and turnkey of this prison since Monday last, the 12th current. So he's kind of giving his credentials, this is who he is, and he's been serving as the jailer. He goes on to say that last night, twixt 7 and 8 of the clock, he viewed and inspected the prison, that the same was sufficient and in as good condition as it was for some time past, that he enclosed some of the prisoners in the Benner room and locked the door upon them in the usual manner, that he enclosed the rest of the prisoners in the other parts of the prison and secured the outer door of the prison, and had the keys of it and of the Benner room door, which he, as jailer or turnkey, brought home and keeped. So he's locked up the prison, he says everything was fine. But twixt the hours of 1 and 2 of the clock in this morning, the deponent was alarmed and acquainted that the said prison or toll booth was broke, and that several of the prisoners had made their escape. That thereupon the deponent came to the toll booth, where he found the lock of the outer door of the prison broke, and upon further inquiry found the 2 great locks upon the Benner room door likewise broke, and also the iron stanchions in the window of the hall broke, through which windows so broken the deponent believed some of the prisoners made their escape. That of the prisoners then in the prison, the following had made their escape: John Grant, alias McFarrick of Belledoe, John McMastery of Glengarry, Miles McPhee of Glengarry, Francis McBain, miller of Dunmaglass, Hugh Chisholm in Strathglass, Archibald Chisholm in Strathglass, John Mackintosh in Glengarry, John Mackintosh in I'm skipping my lines because I'm reading from the original 1750. Anne Fraser of Badenoch, Margaret Mackenzie of Urquhart. He deposed that he was as careful of the prison as it was possible for him to be, and that he knows of no person that was accessory to this escape of the said prisoners or the breaking of the said prison. He also says that coming to the prison this morning, he found a rope hanging from the window down to the street, all of which is truth, as he shall answer to God. So he, despite all his checks of the night before, the prisoners were able to escape, and all the locks were broken, the windows and everything. And there are loads of examples of this, and in 1784-85, it seems to have been a lot going on. In February 1784, Elizabeth Grant of Abernethy, who'd been held for theft or pickery, which I liked, went missing from the prison. And there's another example of a statement like that. The jailer is called before the magistrates to answer what happened. And I laughed out loud when I read it, because he said, yes, the reason that she was able to escape really was that I opened the door and let her out. So he said, I let her walk out with another woman because they said that they were both visitors visiting her. So they just said that was them finished, so I let them out. Said, and it was only when he went to look in her cell later that he realised she had gone. There's a long document from 1785 that records the lengths that a group of men went to escape, creating a decoy, arranging purpose-built crowbars to be smuggled in and hidden under the judge's seat, and as well as small tools to allow them to pick their irons. They also persuaded a female prisoner to step in and help them, but their attempt was not as successful because one of the borough officers walked in just as they were in the middle of trying to escape, and they were standing in the hallway. And apparently one Roderick Mackay did manage to escape in 1773 by tricking the jailer, locking him in the cell. So he came out, asked the jailer to go in. I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book. Why would you fall for that? The jailer went into the cell, Roderick Mackay locked the cell behind him and went off to Nova Scotia, and apparently he took the toll booth key with him, and that is now in the archives in Nova Scotia. Now, all of that goes a long way to explaining why the Inverness toll booth was rebuilt in the 1780s with a new jail and adjacent courthouse. And again, I've been talking particularly about Inverness because that's, as I said, where the bulk of our records relate to. But many of the prisons around the Highlands were tired at this time. So the late 1700s, the early 1800s, buildings are broken and tired down. There are bad conditions, too many people are escaping, and many started to campaign and petition to rebuild. So for instance, Nairn in 1818, about 1819. Now, incidentally, rebuilding the Inverness toll booth was only successful up to a point because escapes did continue to happen. But it's really in the 1830s and 1840s that we start to see substantial changes. And I was so struck as I was researching it, and if any of my colleagues are here, they'll say that I went round yesterday telling them how struck I was by it, that this period of sort of 50 years, from 1830 to 1880, say, such enormous changes in poor relief, in mental health, in education, in prison management. 50 years of huge change. Change to the legislation, which then means systems and procedures change. Each of those pieces of legislation led to new buildings being constructed and completely new record-keeping systems. And so we have this wave of 50 years where our archival collection, our archival heritage changes and becomes much more standardised in all of these areas, but also that our landscape changed because we suddenly have new prisons, new churches, new schools being built. And many of the prison buildings across the Highlands and the court buildings from the 1830s and 1840s still exist, although not as prisons. And so they're often of a similar template, much like the Alexander Ross schools of the 1870s. So for instance, in Nairn, the prison was added to the courthouse, work done in the 1840s, the same time that Dornoch's new prison building was opened, Thames, Cromarty's new courthouse, Dingwall, Fort William, and numerous others changing around that same time. So as I say, a real wave of change. In Inverness, by this point, so the toll booth had been rebuilt in the 1780s, but by this point, again, it's been another, another 60 years or so. The prison was once again tired and needing repaired, in terrible condition again, and those same problems that had been happening were starting to happen again. The building was crumbling, it was overcrowded, and so on. And so petitions for a new building started to come in, including from a lot of sheriffs, judges, and so on, those who had to come on the court circuit. The result of this was that in Inverness a new courthouse was built on the site of the old Inverness Castle in the 1830s, followed by a new prison next to it in the 1840s. So the buildings that we now call Inverness Castle, the South Tower was built as the court and the North Tower built as the prison with more accommodation. I mentioned that a lot of the prisons of this era, a lot of the prisons of this era have a similar look. And that's because the prisons were built under the same architect, Thomas Browne, who in 1837 was appointed architect to the Prison Board of Scotland. So many of them look similar, and again, like those Alexander Ross schools, a turning point where our landscape changed with this not the same, but a similarity across the towns and the boroughs. As I say, a huge change in record keeping and in landscape. I mentioned at the very beginning in that National Records of Scotland summary that the 1839 Act to Improve Prisons included the creation and establishment of county prison boards, and we hold some of those records. So for instance, in Inverness County Council we have a prison board minute book and also a selection of documents relating to one particular governor, including anonymous letters from 1845 saying to the Central Board that they were complaining about the Inverness prison governor's drunken behaviour and absence from work, but also his response to that, his appeal after his suspension. In Ross and Cromarty County Council we have a range of documents relating to that prison board, minute books, letter books, abstracts of accounts and so on. And in these records we see fewer of the individual stories of crime. So in those early ones I've referred to, where the prison is coming up in passing in the court papers. So it's a summary of someone's sentence, and then we can get information about the prison from that, or petitions about their conditions and so on. But when we come into this era of the county boards, we see fewer of those individual stories of crime and much more about the admin and running of the prison service. Again, that mid-19th century change where we see a difference in the sort of information that's recorded. So this is where you would find information about the costs, the practicalities of running the prison buildings, construction, suppliers, and that sort of thing. And you might think that all of these changes, these new buildings, these regulations, the structures, the county boards, would make escape possible and conditions much better. And to some extent it did. I'm sure that there were substantial improvements. But this is an extract from the Ross and Cromarty Council Prison Board Minute Book from October 1843, and it shows that everything didn't improve very quickly. Dingwall Prison, 12th of October 1843. Sir, I beg leave to submit to your notice that the lunatic Robert Brebner in the Dingwall Prison since the 30th of August last, 44 days, is losing the use of his legs through the extreme cold and damp of the only place I have to confine him in. The damp is occasioned by the rain coming down through the old steeple into his cell at nearly all points. And that is the prison keeper, James Stewart, writing that to the clerk of the Ross and Cromarty Prison Board. And this man, Robert Brebner, had been taken in, as I said at the beginning, he's not accused of any crime. He is considered a lunatic in the terms of the day, and they don't know what else to do with him because he's waiting for a place in the Inverness infirmary, but a place hasn't become available, and therefore he's being held in the prison. Another letter appears in there as well. Dear Sir, there is a poor, unfortunate, deranged man at present confined in the Dingwall jail, who is for the last 3 or 4 days unwell, arising from the cold, I have no doubt, which he gets. It is in the green garret that he is confined. Unless a more suitable than his present place of confinement is found for him, and that immediately, the consequences might, to him, be serious. And so the board discussed this. What are they going to do with Robert Brebner? And then a summary, so they've copied those letters they've received into their minute book, had a discussion, and then they record this. The board, understanding by a letter from Duncan Mackintosh, 42 King Street, Inverness, regarding a former lunatic that he has been in practice for several years of taking charge of lunatics until they could be received into an asylum, and that Mackintosh is the brother of the keeper of Inverness Infirmary and is recommended by him. So he is saying, look, I can take this man in until there's a place for him in the hospital. You can take him out of the green garret at the prison and I'll look after him until the place is found for him, a secure bed in the infirmary. So they say that they direct that an application be made to the sheriff for the removal of Brebner from the prison of Dingwall to the charge of the said Duncan Mackintosh until he can be accommodated in the asylum of Inverness. So again, that crossover between mental health and prison, and the story of them has been very, very interlinked and continues to be so. And in fact, that's what I'm speaking to the guys in the prison about next week. That's what they have asked for as a subject. So you can always see that across between a prison as a place of punishment and a prison as a place that is just a secure place to contain people. Now, gradually over the next 60 years or so, most of those prisons across the Highlands and Islands fell out of use. So, for instance, Dornoch Jail closed in 1880. It had been underused, and the prisoners who were left in there were removed to Dingwall. Cromarty stopped having a county jail in 1879, although it did retain a couple of police cells. Wick Jail closed in 1882, and again the prisoners were moved to Dingwall. So again, as we come through a period of change where we don't need those smaller prisons anymore. But the turn of the 19th into the 20th century saw the next substantial milestone for the story of Highland prisons, the construction of HMP Inverness, also known as HMP Porterfield, on Duffy Lane in Inverness, a stone's throw from the castle. And I thought it was interesting, when you take things for granted when you live somewhere, you don't really think too much about it. But as I was writing this, I thought how interesting that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the Highlands main prison, the prison in Inverness, has moved only a couple of times, and each time it has moved just a matter of yards from the previous site. So the toll booth sits at the bottom of the hill, where the castle sits at the top, and HMP Porterfield just sits slightly along from the castle. Porterfield opened in 1902. It was built by prison labour, and it opened with 49 cells of multiple occupancy, I believe. And that led to the closure of the other remaining prisons, i.e. Dingwall. And that building, although with some extensions and some internal changes, has remained in use as the prison for the Highlands, Islands and Moray ever since, some 120 years, housing around 100 people. So it's quite amazing, really, when you think of how many times the toll booth was rebuilt or changed. The castle lasted as a prison for maybe under 60 years, but Porterfield has lasted for 120 plus. It is now no longer fit for purpose, and it's on a very small site. If anyone is familiar with Inverness, they'll know it's a very contained site right in the middle of residential areas. And so construction for the new HMP in Highland is now underway, and that will house over 200 and will continue the Scottish Prison Service's work, focusing very much on rehabilitation, education and opportunities. If you're interested in those more recent years of the Scottish Prison Service, their archives are held centrally at the National Records of Scotland because, of course, at this point we're looking at a nationwide system. But I wanted to finish by going back to something I mentioned right at the beginning. So I've spoken there largely around prisons, as you would probably imagine a prison as a place of punishment for specific crimes against people or against the state. But I wanted to finish by going back to talk about something, as I say, I mentioned right at the beginning, prisons created in response to crisis and the need to hold people somewhere secure. So I said at the beginning that, during the Jacobite risings, churches were sometimes kind of used as makeshift prisons. But the Highlands has, across the years, also played host to prisoner of war camps. In World War I, we had camps in various places, including Kinlochleven and Lentrin, holding, I believe, over 1,000 German and other prisoners of war, as well as conscientious objectors. So some of those may have committed crimes, some of them are just considered kind of general enemies to the current situation, and they need to be secured. But I wanted to finish by talking about perhaps the most famous of these, prisoner of war camp 165 in Wotton in Caithness, described as Britain's most secretive prisoner of war camp. Here's an extract from the Highland Historic Environment Record, and again, if you haven't had a chance to ever look at the Historic Environment Record for the Highlands, just Google it, you'll find all sorts of useful information on there. And this is the summary of how they describe prisoner of war camp 165 in Wotton. This was the site of Britain's most secretive prisoner of war camp, the temporary address of top Nazis. The camp opened in 1943 as a base for local military operations and then for Polish troops. The first prisoners of war arrived in 1945. 2 years later, 2,800 men lived in the huts, whose corrugated iron roofs and concrete floors made them stuffy in summer and freezing in winter. The men were generally well treated despite complaints about the food. Easily spotted in the flat farmland, the few escapees were soon defeated by hunger and weather. The men who posed no threat worked and sometimes lived on local farms. Hardline Nazis were kept within the camp fence. They included Otto Baum, one of the Third Reich's most decorated soldiers, Paul Schroeder, who helped to develop the V-2 rocket, 40 U-boat captains, including ace Otto Kretschmer, Max Wünsche, Hitler's one-time personal assistant, and concentration camp commandant Paul Hoppe. So there's those hardline kind of senior Nazi officers and soldiers kept within the camp walls, but others kept out with. They could work on the land as long as they weren't doing anything to help the war effort, which I think is a really interesting kind of rule. So it goes on to say, people soon made friends with many of the handsome blonde strangers, and they enjoyed concerts and plays in the camp put on by prisoners, some of whom attended the local church. Camp 165 closed in March 1948. Most men were free to return to their homeland, while some were tried for war crimes. One or more stayed to marry local girls. The huts were demolished, although a few foundations remain, and gardeners still unearth broken bottles, pottery and barbed wire, the last reminders, other than memories, of this extraordinary incident. Eventually, I believe, it housed around 4,000, I'm sure, which is quite extraordinary. And among the collections held at Nucleus in our Caithness Archives collections is Valerie Campbell's book Camp 165 Watton, written and researched after hearing her father's memories of stories of the camp. The book contains an overview of the prison camp's beginnings, as well as stories of its impact both on prisoners and on locals, extracts about the conditions and escape attempts. Here is a description written by one person of his time in the camp. This is Herr Schön. He says, the Nissan hut was mostly cold, but we were used to it. It was the same in every camp until 1948 when he was repatriated. In the wintertime, we were allowed a little bit of coal to warm us. The front side had a door and 2 windows. Inside, in the middle, was a corridor, and on both sides of the corridor were bunk beds. I can't remember how many of them. I think on one side 5 and on the other side 4, with a place for a small stove. I think there were about 18 men living in the hut. There was a stove, but no tables, wardrobes or cupboards. We couldn't put up pictures, although most prisoners of war had no photos anyway, as they had either lost them or had them taken away. The wall was made from metal and had the form of waves. At the back of the hut there was a door and a window. Behind the door was a small toilet that was to be used during the night. The guards had the orders to shoot us in the night, but they never did follow it. There are also extracts within this book that detail attempted escapes, such as this one. The first recorded escape in 1947 took place in mid-May, when 2 prisoners from Watton went on the run for 48 hours. An opportunistic escape, this was not pre-planned. The men had discussed escape before, but had not thought about it seriously until the occasion arose. When it did, they had taken their chance and headed off. They had followed the railway tracks south and had gone on to the heathland when they passed villages so that they would not be caught. Lying amongst the heather gave them just enough cover not to be seen from the villagers getting on with their daily business. The northern line from Wick to Inverness weaves its way inland from Watton, covering Scots Calder, Altnabrec to Forcenard, and then turns south, taking in Kimbrace, Kildonan and Helmsdale in Sutherland, before following the coast down as far as Golspie and returning inland again. The 2 prisoners got as far as Kildonan, a tiny rural community west of Helmsdale. They had been seen tramping over the moorland by the wife of a local railway porter, who reported it. However, before the police arrived on the scene, the men had been challenged by 3 local men, and without putting up any resistance, were captured and taken back to Camp 165. This is a recurring theme with Camp 165. Whenever the men who'd escaped were caught, not once did they put up any resistance when challenged. Occasionally it may have been because they were outnumbered or the police had caught them and they didn't want to make things any worse than they already were. A prisoner of war camp was one thing, but prison was something else. Most of the time, however, It seems it was simply because they were hungry and exhausted. And so a short-term prison for a specific duration. And I found it really interesting. Unlike the others we've looked at, it's the other way around. In most prisons, the building will be there indefinitely, but the sentence is temporary indefinite. Whereas with the prisoner of war camps, the buildings were temporary and the sentence was indefinite because they were held until the war finished. And of course, many Highland soldiers were also held in prisoner of war camps overseas, and we hold letters, telegrams and all sorts of things detailing their experiences. But that's for another day and for another Learn with Lorna. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some of those stories, a little bit about some of the prisons, some of the experiences, some of the escapes. If any of you ever get taken to prison, you can always just try saying to the guards that that's you finished now because you were just visiting someone, and see if they let you out. I can say from my visits into the prison that the security is much better than that now. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed hearing about that. Thank you for your lovely comments. As always, Jill, what a nice comment that you've been able to watch live, and it's been the highlight of your week. Thank you, that makes my day and my week. Next week, I hope you can join me. We'll be looking at occupations in the archives and where do we find references to different occupations. That'll be us into the last month before the summer break, so I'm going to take June, July and August off from Learn with Lorna again, which frees me up to do other things. But a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, or if you have any collections or diaries, letters, anything like that that you think might be of interest to add to our collections, please do get in touch with us. Thank you very much. See you next week.